Okay, so this time we're going to have a discussion of data types, no, in PHP. Then later on, we have a logical operators, and just not only logical but conditional and other types of PHP operators.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about some different data types we have inside PHP. And we did actually talk about some examples already, for example, strings and integers. But before we continue our lessons, I really quickly want to cover just a couple more of the basic ones before we do anything else in PHP. So the first one we're going to talk about is, of course, the string. And we did actually talk about the string in previous episodes, but there's just a couple of things I want to mention regarding strings. So let's actually try and create an example here where we create a variable called name equal to a string. And of course, the way we write a string is by writing double quotes, 2 of them, and then we write some text inside of them. So we can actually say coding is fun. And this would actually become a string. So anytime we put characters inside double quotes, it does actually become a string. So this is one way of writing a string, but there's actually another way we can write it. So if I actually go ahead and delete the double quotes and write single quotes instead, this also becomes a string. And there's actually no difference between using single or double quotes. The difference though is that let's say we're writing a long piece of code, and we did already use double quotes once in this line of code we're writing. Now, if I want to include a string inside this piece of code I'm writing, which already has double quotes around it, then I'm going to be canceling out the double quote beginning tag, since I have 4 double quotes inside one line of code, so they're going to cancel each other out. Now, this is one example where we might want to consider using single quotes inside our string instead, since it's not going to interfere with the double quotes we already used. So this is just some basic stuff regarding strings. Let's go on to the other one called an integer. So an integer is basically when we're talking about numbers. So let's actually go ahead and copy our variable up here. And instead of having a string in here, we're just going to go ahead and write, for example, 20, which is going to be an integer. Now, if I were to include some decimal points behind it, it suddenly becomes something we call a float. Now, a float is also a number, but it does actually have decimal points behind it. So we can actually say 5, 7, 8, 4, for example. And it actually becomes what we call a float. Now, why would you want to know that these are different names? Well, when we do actually get to the point where we need to create databases, we do actually need to tell the database what kind of data it should expect to get when we do type something into the database. And if you write that you want, for example, a float or an integer, you should put integers and float into the database. So you do need to know the difference between using floats and integers. So you can't just call all numbers for integers. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is something called a Boolean. And a Boolean is basically a true and false statement. And the reason we want to use these is because a lot of times in PHP, you will actually be using something called conditional testing. So let's say the user does something specific, and you want to check if the user has already done it. So if the user clicks on this button, you could, for example, check if they already clicked another button beforehand. And this is going to return either a true or false statement. So when we talk about true and false statements, we do actually get a value. For example, if we do get a true statement back, then we're going to get a value as 1. If we do get a false statement, then we're going to get a value called 0. So if you do actually check for something, for example, if you go in and check if a database has a certain type of data and it returns back 0, it means that there's no data available inside the database. Now, if it returns as 1, it means that there is in fact something in there. So this is something, or at least an example of using a Boolean. Now, the last data type we're going to talk about is something called an array. And I do know that there's more data types than these, but I don't want to cover them yet, since it might get a little bit difficult, at least this early on. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about arrays as the last type. So an array is basically when we have data. For example, you know how we can create a variable that is equal to, for example, a string or a number or something else? Let's say we have a lot of variables that are connected to one specific thing. Well, in a lot of times then, it's going to be easier to connect them all to one object, one array. So what we can do here is we can actually create a variable called names with an s behind it, because we have more than one now, and set it equal to an array. And the way we write an array is by writing array, parentheses, And inside this array, or at least inside the parentheses, we can start putting data in here. So for example, I'm just going to go ahead and include a couple here. Like so. We can actually put in some double quotes and make sure you separate them with commas. And then inside the first double quote, we could, for example, write Daniel. The second double quote, we can write Dennis. And the last one, we can write Michael. Like so. Now, if we want to spit something out from this array, we can actually, on the next line, echo. And then we need to refer to the variable called names and ask for which kind of data inside the array we want to spit out. And the way we do that is by writing brackets, single quotes, and inside here we're going to go ahead and say either 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on and so on, depending on which data we want to spit out. In this case, Daniel will be 0 because we always start at 0 when we count positions. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2. So if I spit out 0 and actually go ahead and refresh my browser, I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this up here because this will probably give me an error if we do check it in the browser. So if I refresh, you guys can see we spit out Daniel. If I go ahead and write 1, you can see we spit out Dennis. And so on and so on and so on. So this is how an array works, and you will actually be using arrays quite often. I do actually remember in the beginning when I learned about PHP and I heard about arrays, I was thinking to myself, well, I couldn't really see that many examples where we would actually be using arrays, but you will actually be using it quite often. Even if you don't really see how you could use it quite often right now, at some point when we get further in these lessons, you will be using them quite often. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This is all I wanted to mention about different data types. I just want to throw a couple out there, at least some of the basic ones that you need to know about. And you don't really need to memorize these, you just need to know that there is in fact different types of data out there. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so this time we're going to have a PHP arithmetic operators, as I mentioned earlier.
In the next couple of episodes, we're going to be talking about something called operators inside PHP. And in this episode, we're just going to focus on the type called arithmetic operators. Now, as you guys can see, I did actually echo out 5 inside my code, and inside my browser, we then have 5. If I go back to my code and say 5 plus 5, the plus symbol is actually what we call an arithmetic operator. So it's basically, math operators that we use inside math and that sort of thing. So right now we can actually add 5. If I refresh, we get 10. So we can use plus symbols, we can use minus symbols, we can also divide by writing backslash, we can also multiply by writing multiplication, or what do you call it, star. And we have 2 more that I want to talk about. So we also have one called a modulus, and a modulus is when we use percentage. So basically what this does is that it goes in and say, okay, we have 5 divided by 5, and how much do we have left over? So if I were to save this, refresh my browser, you guys can see we get 0. Because right now, 5 divided by 5 has no leftovers. If I were to change the 5 to an 8 instead, we should actually have 3 inside our browser because, 8 divided by 5 is 1 into the 8, and then we have 3 left over. So if we go refresh, we get 3. Now we also have one called a exponentiation, which is when we use multiply in between them instead. So this is basically when we say, let's just go ahead and change this one to 5. When we say 5 to the power of 5. When you have 5 and then you have a small 10 in the corner inside your math equations, and then it says, 10 to the 5. So if we were to say 5 to the power of 5, refresh, we get 3,125. If we were to just say 2, we would get something like 25, which is right here. So these are some of the basic arithmetic operators we have inside PHP, and this is really all we're going to talk about in this episode. In the next episode, we're going to cover something called an assignment operator. In this episode, we're going to talk about something called assignment operators inside PHP. And this is going to be a very short episode because assignment operators are really not that difficult to understand. So I'm just going to give you guys some examples to show you guys what they are. So as you guys can see, on the screen here, I did actually write that we have a variable called x, which is equal to 100. And then underneath here, I just simply echoed out x. So inside my browser, you can see we get 100. Now, let's say that before I echo it out, I want to change the value of x. Now, the way we could do it is by saying, well, we do have a variable called x, which is equal to variable x, because we did actually set it already, plus 20. So right now, if I were to echo out this inside my browser, you can see we get 120. Now, because we as PHP developers don't like writing a lot of code, we can actually write this in a much smaller way. So instead of writing, variable x equal to variable x plus 20, we can actually just write 20 on the other side of the equal sign. And before the equal sign, we're going to go ahead and write plus. This automatically means that we're going to take variable x and put it on the other side of the equal sign as well. And then it's going to be, either plus or minus or whatever we write before the equal sign to the number we have behind here. So if I actually go ahead and refresh the browser now, we should get the same number, which is 120. So we can also go ahead and use the modulus. We can also use the other, exponentiation if you want to use that we talked about in the last episode. So if I were to write, divide by 20, you can see that we will actually get 5 or 5 inside the browser. So this is basically what assignment operators are, and this is basically what we're going to cover in this episode. So I'm just going to leave it off here, and in the next episode, we're going to talk about comparison operators inside PHP. So hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. In this episode, we're going to talk about something called comparison operators inside PHP, and this is actually a really important episode for you guys because you will actually be using comparison operators quite often when you write PHP code. So as you guys can see, I did actually write some stuff on the screen already. I wrote that variable x is equal to 5 and variable y is equal to 10. I also wrote something down here, which we didn't actually talk about yet, called an if-else statement. Now, the basic idea behind an if-else statement is we're going to put something inside these parentheses, and if that is true, then it's going to do whatever I put down here. If whatever's inside the parentheses are false, then it's going to jump down to the next line and do this down here instead. So what we can do here is we can actually go ahead and take our variables called x and y, put them inside the parentheses, and then write something in between them to compare them to each other. So that's what we mean by comparison operators. Whatever we put in between these two variables are going to be the comparison operator. So I can actually go ahead and check if these are equal to each other by writing equal equal. Now, you need to understand the difference between writing equal, 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 and equal, 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 because there's actually a difference between them. So when we write equal, we're saying that x is equal to 5. If you write equal, equal, I can actually write it up here as well, then we're actually checking if x is the same as 5. So there's a difference between using different types of equal signs, and this is something that some people might get a little bit confusing in the beginning when they start learning PHP. So as long as you learn these differences, you should be fine. So right now we're actually checking if x is the same as y. And as we can see, it's not. So if I go in and refresh the browser, it should actually say false. And as you guys can see, if I zoom in a little bit, it does actually say false. Now we can also go ahead and say, well, okay, so these are not equal to each other. If I do actually go up and change my 10 to a 5, now they should actually be equal to each other and say true. So if I refresh the browser, you can say it says true. Now we can also go in and say, okay, but what if I want to check if these are not equal to each other? We're actually going to be using a symbol called exclamation mark and put it in front of the equal signs. And we're actually going to remove one of the equal signs. So we're basically replacing one of the equal signs with an exclamation mark, which basically says if x is not equal to y, then it needs to print out true. And right now, it should actually say false because x is in fact equal to y. They're both 5. So if I go refresh the browser, you guys can say it says false. So if you go back again and change the 5 back to a 10, refresh the browser, it will in fact say true. Now, let's actually go ahead and talk about the next equal sign when we put 3 in here. Basically what we're saying here is that if x is equal to y and is the same data type, then it should print out true. So if I go ahead and refresh the browser, it should probably say false because both x and y are not equal to each other. So actually both of these conditions, actually no, one condition is not true right now because they're both the same data type, but they're not the same, number. So if I actually change my 5 to a 10, it will actually say true because now both conditions are true. It's the same number and the same data type. Now, if we actually go in and change the y to a string instead by putting, double quotes around the 10, refresh the browser, you guys will notice it will actually say false. And that's because right now the x is a 10, which is an integer, and y is a string, even though it says 10. If I do actually remove one equal sign, it does not check for data type, meaning that these are in fact the same number. So if I refresh the browser, it says true, even though they're not the same data type. Now, we do also have some other ones. And let me actually just go ahead and go back a little bit. So we have 5 for x and 10 for y. So if I go in and delete the equal signs inside the if statement, we can actually say if x is lesser than y, then it should say true by using the lesser than symbol. If I go refresh the browser, you'll say it says true because x is 5, which is lesser than 10. If I change this one to greater than, it says false. Now we also have one that says lesser than or greater than and equal. So we can actually say if it's greater than and equal, it still says false. So right now I can actually set it to, let's say we both have 10 for x and 10 for y. So right now it's not greater than, like x is not greater than y, but it is in fact equal to, meaning that we will actually get true. So we have a bunch of different statements here, and there's a lot of them out there. Well, there's not a lot of them out there. I think we did actually cover most of them. There's one more that we didn't actually cover. Actually, two we didn't cover yet, which is if you want to check if something is not the same number and data type, again, you just replace one equal sign with an exclamation mark. Okay, so that's the basic difference here. Another one we can use to check if something is not identical or not equal to each other, which would be the same as this right here, which we talked about in one of the first ones. We can actually go ahead and write lesser than and equal to, lesser than and greater than, and it will in fact check if these are not equal to each other. And it's the same thing. So I usually don't use this one because there's another one that does the same one, but that's actually the last one we're going to talk about. So that's the basic idea behind comparison operators, and I'll see you guys next time.
Okay, so this time we're going to have an increment and decrement in PHP. Actually, even in C language programming, Java, C++, we're going to use increment and decrement. So how we'll be able to use this one or increment and decrement in PHP?
In this episode, we're going to talk about something called increment and decrement operators. And as you guys can see, right now we do actually have a variable called x, which is equal to 10. Underneath here, we simply echo out variable x, meaning that inside the browser I'm going to get 10. Now, the idea behind increment and decrement is that we can actually take a number, for example the 10 we have here, and increase it or decrease it by 1. Now you might be asking, why do we need to learn this? Well, in a later episode, we're going to talk about something called loops. And before we start talking about loops, we need to learn how to increment or decrement numbers. So we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into it here. Now, down where we say echo x, we're going to go ahead and add plus plus in front of variable x. And what this means is that we're going to go ahead and add 1. Now, you might be asking, why does plus plus means that we add 1? Well, it just does in PHP and JavaScript. So don't get it wrong. 1 plus does not mean we add 1. And 2 pluses doesn't mean we add 2. Plus plus means we add 1. So 2 pluses for 1 add, if I can say it that way. So we're going to go ahead and refresh the browser now. And you guys will notice we get 11 instead. Now, if I go back in here, you might be asking, well, does the positioning matter of the pluses? Yes, it does. If I put it before variable x, I'm saying I'm going to echo. Well, actually, I'm going to add 1 and then echo out variable x. But if I put the pluses afterwards, I'm actually going to echo out variable x and then add 1. So if I refresh the browser now, you guys will actually notice we get 10 again. But if I go back again, go underneath here and echo variable x, you guys will notice that afterwards we will actually have 10 and then we're going to have 11, because we echo out 10 and then we add 1 and then we echo out variable x again, meaning we get 11 now. So adding pluses will add, but what about subtracting? If I go ahead and remove the pluses again and refresh the browser, you guys will see we will actually get 10, 10, because we didn't add anything now. If I go back again, and before the echo, at least the first echo, I'm going to say minus minus. If I refresh the browser, we're going to get 9. Of course, we're going to get 9, 9, because we will actually go in and say we're going to, subtract 1, then echo out variable x. Underneath here, variable x is still 9, so we're going to echo out variable x again. So we get 9, 9. So if I actually go ahead and take the minuses, put it in front of variable x, at least the first one, refresh the browser, you guys will see it says 10, 9, because we don't actually subtract before we actually get to the second echo, which is down here. So that's the basic idea behind increment and decrement, and this is not really difficult, but we will need to learn how to do this for a later episode. So learning about this right now is a pretty good idea. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. In this episode, we're going to talk about something called logical operators inside PHP. And as you guys can see, we do actually have some stuff on the screen already. We have x, which is equal to 10, and we have y, which is equal to 20. Now, the basic idea behind logical operators is that we can actually go ahead and add more statements or more conditions inside something like an if statement, for example. And as you guys can see, we do actually have an if statement down here. And if you guys don't remember, an if statement basically says if whatever's inside the parentheses are true, then it's going to do whatever's down here. Now in this case, I did actually put in x and asked if it was equal to y. And in this case, it's not. So it's actually not going to print out true because this statement is false. So if we go and refresh the browser, you guys can see it does actually not say anything. Now, logical operators basically allows for us to combine multiple statements or like conditions next to each other. So we can actually check for more things than just one thing. So if I go after the y we have here and say or, and add another condition, for example, I could ask if 1 is in fact equal to 1, which is actually true because 1 is actually equal to 1, they're the same. You can actually see that we do actually get true inside the browser, because right now it's checking if this is true, or if this is true, then do this down here. And in this case, one of them is actually true, so it's just going to do whatever's down here. Now we can also use another one called and in between here, which basically says that both of these statements has to be true. So if I actually go ahead and refresh the browser, you guys can see that it does not write anything because this one is in fact false. If I do actually go up and change x to 20, you guys will see that now both statements are actually true, and it does actually say true. So there's a couple of different ways we can actually write this, and I do actually recommend, or not recommend, I prefer writing it the other way because it does actually look a little bit cooler. Instead of using or, we're actually going to go ahead and use these symbols here, and I don't actually know what they're called in English, but it's a vertical line going, up and down. And if you have two of them next to each other, they will in fact do the same thing as writing or. So if I do actually save this and go refresh the browser, you guys can see it does actually say true, because I did actually change the x back to 10. So only one statement down here is actually true, and it still writes out true because it's taking or and not and. Now, if we want to write symbols, or at least the symbols for and, we can actually write ampersand, ampersand, which does the exact same thing as writing and. So if I refresh the browser, you guys can see it says nothing, because one of these conditions are in fact false. Now, we have another one, which is called XOR, like this, which basically says that one of these conditions has to be true, but there can only be one condition that has to be true. Meaning that right now, 1 is in fact equal to 1, x is not equal to y, so it will in fact print something out on the screen, as you guys can see here. Now, if I do actually change x to 20 again, so now x is in fact equal to y, both of these conditions will be true. But if I go refresh the browser, you can see it says that it's false. And that's because we are basically saying here that one of these conditions has to be true, but we can't have both of them being true. So that's the basic logical operators we do actually have inside PHP. We will be using these as well at some point. Usually when you do more complicated stuff, or not complicated stuff, but usually when you do something that's not very, very basic, you do usually use these kind of conditions here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, we're going to start talking about these if statements. And we're actually going to talk about all the different types of statements we have that are similar to the if statement. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.
So I think that's it. So next meeting, we're going to have a PHP control structures, no, which covered conditional statement and looping, no? So thank you for attending our class and good day, everyone.